Thank you for attending the latest webinar in our speaker series, brought to you by Greenest Health Medical Interest Group of the Ontario Medical Association. Tonight we are presenting Mr. Seth Klein. Seth Klein is a public policy researcher and writer based in Vancouver, BC. Seth is the team lead and director of strategy with the Climate Emergency Unit. And prior to that, he served for 22 years as the founding director of the British Columbia office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. This is also known as the CCPA. This is Canada's foremost social justice think tank. He is now a freelance policy consultant, speaker, researcher, and writer. He's also the author of A Good War, Mobilizing Canada for the Climate Emergency. Seth is also a columnist with the National Observer and an adjunct professor with Simon Fraser University's Urban Studies program. He also remains a research associate with the CCPA's BC office. I have just finished reading A Good War. All I can say is, Seth, have you ever considered running for Prime Minister? Not, what a great loss. This book is a wake-up call about what is possible to combat the climate emergency and how Canada is otherwise letting itself get left behind to our peril. I highly recommend this book. I have been looking incredibly forward to your talk this evening. Put your questions in the chat anytime, and after the talk, in about half an hour, we will check the chat, or you could raise your virtual hand and we will call on you. Now, Seth, over to you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for that kind introduction. I'm glad you liked the book. To answer your question, when you have young kids, you can really only have one politician in the family, and we already have one. My wife is a Vancouver City Councillor who led on the climate emergency here, and she's much better at it than I am. So we'll just have to leave it at that for now. Good evening, everyone, and thanks very much for making time. It looks like it's nice weather there, and so thank you for your interest. As Caroline said, I'm here in Vancouver on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations, and happy to spend an hour with you. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes, drawing on the book that was just so kindly plugged by Caroline, and talk a little bit about mobilizing Canada for the climate emergency. But then I'm really looking forward to plenty of time for Q&A with you all, and I see some other friends on the call who are like Samantha and Millie from the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, who are doing such spectacular work, and I'm hoping we can talk about some of that work as well. So let me just start with this. This past year was really one of reckoning with the climate emergency, especially in my province of British Columbia, where just about a year ago, we had this extreme heat dome event that shattered temperature records. Just last week or the week before, we had the final report from the coroner's office come out confirming that over 600 of our fellow British Columbians died in that week. To drive home what happened, that June heat dome event was the most deadly weather event in Canadian history. Many of your colleagues out here had a horrific experience tending to people who were experiencing that event, and in some cases had patients who died. Most of those who perished were isolated, lower income seniors. And the great tragedy is that it was preventable. You know, if almost all of them died in their homes, and if their homes had already been unplugged from gas and converted to electric heat pump systems, which we urgently need to do to lower emissions from our buildings, these heat pumps that also cool in the summer, it's very likely that every one of those people would still be with us. That was followed by all of these fires and forcing the evacuation of thousands of people from their homes and burning the entire city of Lytton to the ground. And then in November, we had this atmospheric river event, just to add another new word to our climate crisis lexicon, that drowned over 600,000 farm animals and forced 17,000 people from their homes and caused billions of dollars in damage. And there's this tendency whenever one of these events happen to, in the media, they get described as the new normal, but they're not the new normal. And I say this to you as physicians because you will be on the front lines. They are but a taste of things to come. And for all of us who thought that the last 2 years of pandemic living was disruptive, the truth of the matter is we ain't seen nothing if we don't get serious about the climate crisis. And as disruptive as COVID was, it didn't upend our food and water systems the way the climate crisis is and will. And as anxiety producing as the pandemic was, it didn't have the same physical effects that extreme heat does. Remember in the early months of the pandemic when we all used to go outside from our homes at 7 in the evening and bang pots and pans to thank healthcare workers like you. And it strikes me that we were all given a chance to be our best selves, and most of us were. But extreme heat messes with our brains. It undermines our capacity to cope just when we most need to be our best selves. And so make no mistake, we confront an emergency. And if we fail to act quickly, then over the course of the coming decades, things get very grim. A world that is unlivable and catastrophic for many, deeply uncomfortable and disruptive for all others, quite possibly ungovernable. And I want to emphasize this point. It's an ecological crisis, but it is just as equally a human and social justice crisis and a civilizational threat. But that is the last of the scary news that you're going to hear from me tonight. Instead, for all of you who, like me, feel deeply anxious about what we are confronting, I want to offer 2 reflections from my study of emergencies. The book that Caroline referenced there is structured around lessons from the Second World War. And now, of course, we've all lived through another emergency of the pandemic. And when I reflect on all of these emergencies, the war, the pandemic, the climate emergency, I want to offer 2 observations that actually give me some solace, and maybe they would for you too. The first is that all emergencies start with a period of denial. They all start with a period of denial. But my second observation is that at some point, some sort of alchemy occurs, this special combination of events and leadership that shifts the popular zeitgeist and moves us into emergency mode. And once that happens, once these emergencies are recognized for what they are, they transform us. They transform our society, our social relations, our economy, our politics, our leaders. That's what happened in the Second World War. And it happened again, particularly in the first year of the pandemic. But when it comes to the climate emergency, at some level, we're all still in that denial phase, aren't we? Not yet ready to leap into the grand transition. And certainly our political and business leaders are also, for the most part, still in denial. I want to be clear what I mean by that. They're not in denial about human-induced climate change. Most of them say they get that. Rather, they're in denial about what confronting it actually requires. But the truth is, we're all guilty of this at some level, right? We're all making our futile little bargains with the laws of nature. Please, just a little more time with this vehicle, or one more trip, or, please, a few more barrels of oil, or my personal favorite, please let us have this pipeline and we'll use the money to fund the transition. So the alchemy's first ingredient, the transformative events, those are already happening. That's what these extreme weather events are. But the alchemy's second ingredient, the leadership, is not there yet. So with my book and now the work that I do with the Climate Emergency Unit, I'm trying to adopt or call for the adoption of really an entirely new and different approach to the crisis than the one that we've pursued to date. And trying to walk this line between telling the truth about the severity of the crisis we face, but also it's been gratifying to me that for the most part, people find the book unusually hopeful, notwithstanding the dire subject matter. And as I mentioned, the book is structured entirely around these Second World War lessons, because I see in the history of our wartime experience this helpful and indeed hopeful reminder that we have done this before. We have mobilized in common cause across class and race and gender to confront an existential threat. And in the process, we have retooled the entire economy, twice in fact, once to ramp up military production, another time to reconvert to peacetime, all in the space of 6 years. So for all of us who wonder, who realize how big the task is, and we wonder in the back of our minds all the time, like, can we really do this? The Second World War story has an answer, which is, yeah, we can, because we have. A core contention that I'm making is that we need a new emergency approach to the climate crisis, because what we've been doing is simply not working. And I want to
interrupt, Mr. Klein. The video feed has just cut out, and there's just some folks commenting. I'm not sure if there's slides or your video's just off.
Oh, that's weird. Okay, yeah, I saw that it cut out. Has it been out there? Can you see me now?
Yes, we can see you now.
Okay. Was I gone for a while?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, thanks for interrupting, but you could hear me.
We can hear you perfectly.
Okay. Yeah, there might be something odd going on with my my internet account, but hopefully it'll cooperate. So I do want to screen share something that shows why I think we need a new approach. Are you seeing this?
Yes, we can see that.
Okay. Well, so that's Canada's greenhouse gas emissions going back the last 20 years, with a little hat tip to Greta Thunberg and her apt description of climate promises to date is so much blah, blah, blah. We do have 2020 data now, and it does show a decline. But recall that 2020 was the year of lockdown, when so much travel didn't happen. And lots of people are concerned that once we get the 2021 data, it will pop back up. For the most part, when you look at a chart like this, what you basically see is a flat line. Our GHG emissions plateaued at this historic high. To put this in the language that we now understand from the pandemic, we have failed to bend the curve. We are not on a path to stave off a horrific future for our kids and future generations. We have run out the clock. And now here we are, staring down this gap between what the science says we urgently have to do and what our politics seems willing or capable of entertaining. And somehow we've got to kickstart something new. So I'm frequently asked, how do you know when a government actually gets the emergency, when they're in emergency mode? And in answering that question, I've come up with this, what I call the 6 markers of emergency. And they're derived from the book, but they're also the framework that we now use with the Climate Emergency Unit that I now work with. And here they are. Are you seeing them? So these are the markers for when you know that a government has actually shifted into emergency mode. And they were written for, with an eye to federal and provincial governments, but really they apply to any large institution, an economic sector, a university or a hospital, a crown corporation, a pension fund, a faith institution, a post-secondary, this is how you can know that the leadership is actually there. So the first marker is that it spends what it takes to win. The second marker is that it creates new economic institutions to get the job done. The third is that it shifts from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures as needed. The fourth is that it tells the truth about the severity of the crisis and communicates a sense of urgency about the measures necessary to combat it. The fifth is that it understands that we must leave no one behind. That if we are asking society to undertake a full-scale mobilization, you need social solidarity for that. And that means communicating clearly that we're all in this together. And the final one is that Indigenous leadership and rights and title is central to winning. In the Second World War, the Canadian government hit the first 5 of those markers. Likewise, I would say, if we all reflect on the first year of the pandemic, I think the federal government actually hit the first 5 pretty darn well. But with respect to the climate emergency, so far anyway, neither our federal government nor any provincial government of any political stripe actually hits any of them. So I just want to run through them a little bit more and offer a few additional reflections, and then we'll open this up to Q&A. That first marker about spending what it takes to win, you know, in the first year of the pandemic, federal government spending really was remarkable, wasn't it? And the Canada's debt to GDP ratio went from about 30% to 50% in a single year. That's a big jump in a single year. It still pales in comparison to what we did in the Second World War. We finished the war with the debt to GDP ratio well over double that, over 100%. And just to give you some perspective on this, the federal government, during the whole first year of the pandemic, the Bank of Canada was buying up federal government securities in order to finance the CERB and the wage subsidy and the whole emergency response to the tune of $5 billion a week for most of a year. In comparison, the Trudeau government spending on climate is about $10 billion a year, like 2 weeks of COVID spending in that first year. So we're not just spending a little less than we should, we're spending a lot less than we should. The second marker, create the economic institutions needed to get the job done. During the Second World War, starting from a base of almost nothing, the Canadian economy pumped out a volume of military equipment that's just mind-blowing, right? In those 6 years, Canada produced 800,000 military vehicles, more than Germany, Italy, and Japan combined. 16,000 military aircraft, ultimately building the fourth largest air force in the world at the time. Here in my province, where we struggle to build a single BC ferry these days, we produced over 300 ships, again, from a base of almost nothing. And the Canadian government, under the leadership of C.D. Howe, who was no lefty, by the way, you know, he's on the right wing of the Mackenzie King cabinet, they established 28 crown corporations in order to expedite that military production. They were just in a remarkable hurry. And they were also doing a remarkable job of coordinating supply chains in order to make sure that this would all happen. But in response to the climate emergency, we've seen nothing of the sort. So in contrast to these 28 wartime crown enterprises, the Trudeau government has created 2 new crown corporations during its time in office, the Canada Infrastructure Bank, and the other one, I hate to tell you, is the Trans Mountain Pipeline Corporation. It's the one that makes us all the proud owners of a 60-year-old oil pipeline from Alberta to my province. And by the way, a fellow doctor of yours and friend of mine named Dr. Tim Takaro just yesterday was sentenced to 30 days in jail for protesting that pipeline and trying to defend his students at SFU. So if our government really saw the climate emergency as an emergency, it would, like C.D. Howe did, quickly conduct an inventory of all of our conversion needs and determine how many heat pumps and solar arrays and wind farms and electric buses we're going to need to electrify virtually everything and end our reliance on fossil fuels. And then we'd see a new generation of public corporations to ensure those items are manufactured and deployed at the requisite scale. The third marker, shift from voluntary and incentive-based policies to mandatory measures. Now, I know mandatory measures are a hot topic these days. But we know when I showed you earlier that our GHG, I'm going to stop screen sharing here. When I showed you that our GHG emissions had merely flatlined for 20 years, you know, why is that? I think a big reason for that is that if you survey our federal and provincial climate policies today, you know what they almost all have in common? They're voluntary. We encourage change. We incentivize change. We offer rebates. We send price signals. What we have not done is actually require change. And so if we're going to meet the GHG targets that we urgently need to hit, we have to set clear near-term dates by which certain things will be required. For example, we would declare that you won't be able to buy a new fossil fuel burning vehicle after 2025, or we would mandate that no new buildings can tie into gas lines as of next year. That's what the city of Vancouver has done, by the way, right? As of this year in Vancouver, thanks to the motion from my wife, I told you about it at the outset, no new buildings in Vancouver can use fossil fuels for space and water heating. That's years ahead of the provincial targets. And here's another mandate. We would ban advertising by fossil fuel vehicle makers and gas stations. Now, because you're a group of doctors, let me make sure you're all aware that just last week, we saw the launch of a national campaign to ban fossil fuel advertising. I'll share the campaign website in the chat in a bit, or someone else can. But CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, is the lead on this national effort, and kudos to them. The campaign launched last week with a letter to a bunch of federal ministers calling for the banning of fossil fuel advertising. And it was signed by 34 health organizations, including some fairly mainstream ones. So the OMA's equivalent in my province, Doctors of BC, signed it. The College of Physicians and Surgeons signed it. The College of Family Physicians signed it. Fantastic. It was so great to see. I mean, those kinds of measures signal to the public that this is serious, which brings me to marker 4, tell the truth and rally the public at every turn. It took leadership to mobilize the public in World War II. In frequency and in tone, in words and in action, emergencies need to look and sound and feel like emergencies. And the leaders that we best remember from the Second World War were these outstanding communicators who walked this careful line, right? They were forthright with the public about the gravity of the crisis, and yet still managed to impart hope. And their messages were amplified by a news media that knew what side of history it wanted to be on, and by an arts and entertainment sector keen to rally the public. And likewise, we've all lived through the last, particularly the first year, of our governments modeling emergency communication throughout the pandemic, right? The messages are ubiquitous. We get daily press briefings. We heard regularly from public health officials. The media took seriously its duty to provide necessary information on a daily basis. That's what emergency looks and sounds and feels like. But none of this consistency and coherence, however, is present with respect to the climate emergency. And when our governments don't act as if the situation is an emergency, or worse, when they send contradictory messages by approving new fossil fuel infrastructure, they are effectively communicating to the public that it's not an emergency. Marker 5, leave no one behind. This is a thread that runs through my book, that inequality is toxic to social solidarity. And some of the climate policy people you hear in the news, or maybe who've even come and spoken to your group, have a tendency to say, don't link the fight on climate to inequality and all these other social justice issues. Don't make it any more complicated. It's hard enough as it is. It is my strong view that they're wrong. And they're wrong at 2 levels. First of all, they're wrong because these issues are totally connected. The richer you are, the higher your emissions. The poorer you are, the more vulnerable you are to climate change. But we also need to link these things because that's how we win. A successful mobilization requires that people make common cause across class and race and gender, and that the public have confidence that sacrifices are being made by the rich as well as middle and modest income people. Just to jump back to my historic references, during the First World War, inequality undermined that kind of social solidarity. It actually undermined recruitment for the war. And consequently, at the outset of the Second World War, by the way, in the First World War in particular, the fact that some companies were engaged in rampant profiteering, really grotesque profiteering, while other people were offering up their lives, right? That undermined that social solidarity. So that and by the way, on that, the kind of profiteering we've seen in the pandemic was illegal in the Second World War, because at the outset of the Second World War, the King government took these bold steps to lessen inequality and limit excess profits. So we saw progressive taxation introduced in the war big time. Corporate taxes went up, then excess profits tax came in. Canada's first major income transfer programs came in. Unemployment insurance came in the war. The family allowance came in the war. This famous Marsh report that laid the architecture for the whole post-war welfare social system was written during the war and offered up to Canadians as a pledge and a promise that the country they would come back to would look different and be more fair and more just than the one they were leaving behind. That's when you saw the mobilization. That's when you get the recruitment numbers. And I think all of this has an echo in the present with the appeal of something like the Green New Deal. What the polling tells us is that when you link bold climate action to bold action tackling inequality and offering a good jobs guarantee and speaking to people's economic insecurity, the support for the bold climate action doesn't go down, it goes through the roof. And the final marker, the sixth marker, is around Indigenous leadership and rights and title. About 20% of the major renewable energy projects that have occurred in Canada have happened under Indigenous leadership, far in excess of their share of the population. But it's also my view that in this awkward period in which we find ourselves, where our mainstream politics is just dithering and dodging on meaningful and coherent climate action, over and over and over again, it has been the assertion of Indigenous title and rights that keeps buying us time, slowing and blocking new fossil fuel projects until our larger politics comes into compliance with what the climate science says we have to do. In fact, just last year, Oil Change International and the Indigenous Environment Network tried to calculate all of the GHGs that have been left in the ground because of Indigenous-led efforts to block fossil fuel projects. And they found it to be equivalent to about 25% of North American domestic emissions. I mean, that is remarkable. So those are the six markers. I'm looking forward to digging into these a bit more in Q&A. But let me close this part of the talk with this. Like many of you, because you're on this committee, and thank you for your time with this committee. As I read the latest scientific warnings, I'm afraid. In particular, I feel deep anxiety about the state of the world that we're leaving my kids and kids in general, and those who are going to live out through most of this century and beyond. All of us who take seriously these scientific realities wrestle at some level with despair, right? That is the ambiguous time in which we live. The truth is, we don't know if we're going to win this fight, if we're going to rise to the challenge in time. But consider this. In the Second World War, Canada was a population a little over 11 million people. From that, over 1 million Canadians enlisted. That is remarkable, isn't it? 64% of them under the age of 21. But it's worth remembering and appreciating that all of those people who rallied in the face of fascism 80 years ago, you know what they didn't know? They didn't know they would win. You know, we forget that there was a good chunk of the war's early years when the outcome was far from certain. We know how their story ended, but they didn't. And yet they rallied regardless. And in the process, they surprised themselves by what they were capable of achieving, not just on the battlefront, but on the home front too. And I think that's the spirit we're going to need as we face down these next few years and this crossroads moment, this little window of time in which we're going to decide whether or not we give our kids a fighting chance. All right, let me stop there and let's go to Q&A.
Thank you, Seth. So I'm going to just look into the chat, and I like this question. So Brent Elsie says, who do you see as the leaders for this crisis? Who are the Churchill, King, and Roosevelts of our time? Even today's C.D. Howe?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
They're out there. And I have to say, I really enjoy engaging with political leaders across the country now with the ideas in the book. And often these conversations begin that way, like a little bit of history sharing about people like C.D. Howe and trying to, was it Brent who asked the question? The fun part about the last year and a half since the book came out, and I've given about 150 talks, it's been remarkable to me how resonant this 80-year-old story remains that you're asking about. And regardless of the audience I'm speaking to, I get to make a little mischief with them, that whether or not they are, they could be liberals or New Democrats or farmers or journalists or architects or business people or labor people. I get to dig into their World War II story a bit and point to the people who are important to their own sense of purpose and legacy, and who did something remarkable at a time of emergency, and then say, right, and here we are again with another civilizational threat at our doorstep, and who do you want to be? And that's been fun doing that with some political leaders. The bad news is that, as I said earlier, all of our current governments are still in that phase of what I call the new climate denialism. So they accept the science of climate change, but they are in denial about what confronting it actually means. But there are individual political leaders who are climate champions. I know I'm biased in telling you this, but I would say my wife is one of them. When she introduced the first climate emergency municipal motion in English Canada a month after she was first elected, and that has resulted in Vancouver having arguably the most ambitious municipal climate plan in North America, I would say. The Vancouver plan hits those markers. They are spending at a municipal level what you need to win. They're creating new institutions like neighborhood energy utilities. They hit marker 3. Marker 3 is key for a city, by the way. The marker 3 was the one about moving from voluntary to mandatory. In any given city, including all your cities, if you're in a city, over 50% of the GHG emissions are the gas we burn in our buildings. And as of this year, new buildings in Vancouver cannot burn that gas. And they're putting existing buildings on a schedule where over the next few years, they will have to swap out their gas boilers and furnaces for electric. So they're in emergency mode. And there are other politicians like that across the country at the federal, provincial, and municipal level. But we do need to bolster their ambition and back them up. I'll say a bit more about the Vancouver story because it relates to your role as community leaders too. The council that my wife sits on is very politically all over the map. There's no majority. They're all over the political spectrum. You never know how this gang's going to vote on anything. And yet those early climate emergency motions passed unanimously. Now, how did that happen? Some of it is because my wife's really good at her job. But she would say that it happened because each time those votes happened, dozens of high school students skipped school. They rallied outside, they spoke in front of council, they filled the chambers, and they basically made it politically impossible for even the conservative councillors to vote no. So when you get that combination of a political champion, some people in the bureaucracy who are committed to it, and outside voices demanding it, that trifecta is when the magic happens.
Thank you, Seth. I'd like to go on to another comment or question. So Keith Hay says, Seth, I really enjoyed the roadmap your book lays out to address the climate emergency. What we lack is political will to implement changes you propose. In Ontario, 1 in 6 voters were enough to elect a majority climate, denying provincial government. Our Prime Minister bailed on his promise to reform our electoral system. Have you thoughts on how to move our political and business leaders beyond their virtually ubiquitous denial?
Well, we are in an awkward and frustrating place right now. There's no question about that. You're all more expert on how things unfolded in your Ontario election than I am out here, but I would offer the observation that, first of all, you're quite right that it was really only a tiny share of the population that voted for this government. But it's also the case that the main opposition parties didn't excite people with that alternative vision. And so the people who, particularly under our current electoral system, for the voter who gets the emergency and are seeking to give that political expression, they were endlessly frustrated. So the pressure is going to have to come. Of course, I favor electoral reform and proportional representation, but I'm not hopeful that we will win that soon. And so we have to work with the hand in which we're dealt and force them into emergency mode. And this is where I think I want to emphasize this because of who you all are. We are seeing some really important leadership from, in particular, CAPE, the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. And, you know, I want to recognize the kind of work that Millie and Samantha have done. In particular, they were part of bringing together this Ontario climate emergency campaign and this 12-point plan that over 200 organizations have now signed on to. So it's starting to signal to the political folks, look at all of these people who want a genuine climate emergency agenda, who will reward an agenda like that, and who may punish those who won't do it. The kind of leadership in the ad ban campaign that has come from health organizations. And here in my province, I was talking about getting gas out of buildings. One of the CAPE in British Columbia has also been one of the key actors pushing for, at a provincial level, because Vancouver's done it, but the province hasn't, pushing to get a gas ban out of new buildings. So the physician voices have been important. And we're not going to win on any of these things if it's just the environmental groups. More, and that's part of the model that we're using with the climate emergency unit. We're trying to marshal those institutions from outside the environmental movement, health organizations, faith institutions, labor organizations, farming organizations, to give that voice to climate emergency. I'm going to share some of the links to the things that I mentioned in the chat so that you can look them up while we're talking, but feel free to jump to the next question. But here, I'm going to share with you, first of all, here's a link to my book. If you want, for those of you who aren't familiar with it and want to look it up, here is a link to the climate emergency unit. And I'll put that in there in a sec. And in particular, I invite you to sign up to the newsletter for the climate emergency unit. And then that way you can stay informed of all of our campaigns as they unroll. Here is the link to this fantastic fossil fuel ad ban campaign that all the and from there, the link there, Stop Fossil Fuel Ads, you can see the open letter, you can see all the health groups that have signed on, and you can sign on as individuals. And I referenced the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign that Samantha and Millie are part of. So here is the link to that and the 12 climate actions where they are encouraging or other organizations to sign on. And Samantha and Millie, feel free to jump on if you want to add to any of these.
Thank you. I noticed that Samantha Green has also been adding some links, very relevant links. I think there may be some duplication there, but everybody check out the chat for those. And there.
Oh, so she did. Sorry about that.
Yeah. So anyway, so there's a question from Catherine Phillips. She says, is any country doing climate at the level you are discussing?
Not quite. And that's why I point to the Vancouver example. But I'm going to show you something else, because there is a tendency where we like to think that, you know, a lot of the public, when you poll them, say it's very important to them that Canada be a leader, and they are under the impression that Canada is a leader. And I'm just trying to open up a document to share with you. Give me one sec on this question. Sorry, I'm having difficulty opening it. My computer's got too many things running and starting to act up. The point of what I was trying to show you is that if you look at Canada against all the other G7 countries, we have the worst record. In particular, countries like the UK and Germany substantially outperform us in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. They don't have the flat line like I showed you there. They have surpassed a number of them, the Kyoto targets, and they are on a solid downward track. And interestingly, that has happened under governments, conservative and labor. It's unfortunate that in many of those places, climate hasn't been politically weaponized in the way that that we see play out in Canada.
Okay, thank you.
So none of them hit all the markers. They're not in full-on emergency mode, but they are doing substantially better than us.
Yeah. So I want to, okay, so Millie has a few things to say. I'm going to try to encapsulate because she's always tremendous. So just a couple of comments and then I'm going to get to her question. She comments that we in Ontario, lowest provincial election voter turnout in history. That is a dubious thing that you don't want to hear. So that was on June the 2nd of this year. And yeah, and then she also mentioned that also, which is good news, over 250 diverse groups signed on thus far for the climate emergency, for the open letter, which is representing over 850, I think, thousand Ontarians currently for the Ontario Climate Emergency Campaign. So that's tremendous. And then I'd just like to read her question. The sense of wartime urgency is clearly not occurring yet with the climate emergency. What role do you feel is played by the fact that the consequences of climate crisis do not play out in real time relative to the time at which the climate damage is being done, but rather well into the future? How do we convey wartime urgency given that disconnect and within a timeline where we are still in a position to take impactful action? And then comment, thanks for the great talk.
Yeah, thanks. Well, that is indeed the challenge. And, the curse of climate relative to COVID, relative to the war, is that it moves in slow motion. And in particular, that these events, because I said at the outset, it's always a combination of leadership and events that shift a population into emergency mode. But the extreme weather events in climate don't happen everywhere at the same time. And so they fail to galvanize us as a nation in the same way, right? When we had this extreme heat dome event a year ago, it changed the terrain here in British Columbia. But for all of you in Ontario, how did you, I would say even here in British Columbia, we haven't come to terms fully with the scope of the loss. But I suspect for you in Ontario, it was more distant, right? And now, last week we're all watching flooding in Calgary and Alberta, and it's a little distant for all of us, right? So that's the curse. But here's the thing, and this is why I said out in the outset, all emergencies start with a period of denial. And then something happens to shift it. A lot of people assume when I first started to share with people as I was writing the thesis of my book, people would say to me, oh, well, in the Second World War, everyone understood the threat to be clear and present. No, they didn't. If you were in Europe, the threat was clear and present. But if you were in Canada, the threat was on the other side of two oceans. And at the beginning of the war, the public was not at all keen or on board to do this. It actually took work and leadership to bring the public where they needed to go. And similarly, we all have the benefit now of this experience of the pandemic, where we can all remember back in January or so, a little over 2 years ago, when we first started to hear about this virus on the news. We were all in denial, weren't we, about how it was about to upend our lives. And then certain events happen, and certain leadership happened. So I don't know what you remember. I remember when they canceled the NBA season. You know, I remember, now I don't even watch basketball, but I remember thinking, whoa, that's different. And I also know that seeing our prime minister in front of his house every morning communicated that something major was underway that was going to change our lives. But you know, Millie, I don't know if this gives you some solace, but all I would say to you is this. If you had asked Canadians in 1938, this gang in Mackenzie King's cabinet, you know, do they have what it takes to completely transform Canadian society and the economy as was about to happen? I'm certain most Canadians would have said no. And they had no reason to believe otherwise, because the same gang had been sticks in the mud through 10 years of the Depression. And similarly, if you had said to me a few months before the pandemic, you know, are there people at Finance Canada and the Bank of Canada capable of quickly pivoting in the space of weeks and creating these audacious programs like the CERB and the wage subsidy? I would have said no, there's no one home there who thinks that way. And I would have been wrong. Turns out there were. So with any emergency, you know, sometimes the leaders we have become the people we need them to be, and sometimes they have to be replaced. One or the other is going to happen. And the question I can't answer for you, Millie, is whether or not it will happen in time. That is the ambiguous time we're in.
Thank you, Seth. I'm going to ask one more question in the chat, and then I'm going to open it up if people want to unmute themselves. Karen Slatkovsky says, thank you so much, Seth, for the largely hopeful messaging we are so desperately needing. Polarization between those willing to work towards the collective good and those fighting for, quote, their individual rights can undermine organizational efforts in, quote, marker 3, establishing mandatory policies, as seen with the protest of public health policies related to the pandemic. Her question is, how do we bring the me first people into the fold?
It's a great question. So here's the thing. In any time mandatory measures come in, you never have unanimity. And there's always an antisocial subset of the population that won't be on board or tries to work around it. That was true in the war. Everyone wasn't on board on rationing and things like that, but most were. Obviously, in the pandemic, my observation was it was actually the public ahead of our politicians saying, make it mandatory, bring in the masks, right? And then the politicians came along after. But of course, we see this antisocial reaction as well as manifested by the convoy. The same dynamic will happen when it comes to climate mandates. You know, just to become your weird uncle one last time here with my stories from the war. At the beginning of World War II, the governments of Canada, the UK, the US, they were all very anxious that if they were to bring in rationing, they would face a kind of popular revolt. But then they had to bring in rationing, and it didn't happen. Instead, rationing actually became one of the most popular measures that they took. Popular because, first of all, it was the way that everyone could do their bit. And secondly, they could know that it was going to unfold in a fair way, that everyone would have to do their bit. This is the benefit of mandatory measures. It strikes me that when it comes, again, you'll always have the antisocial dissenters, but when it comes to the war or the pandemic and those COVID mandates or climate mandates, in the main, most of us want to do the right thing. We want to do right by our neighbors and our family and people we care about and protect them. But it irks us, because nobody wants to be a chump, that we would do the right thing and our neighbor undoes our good efforts, right? And that's the benefit of mandatory measures. You don't have to worry about your neighbors. They're going to have to come along. But I want to, so these are the similarities, but I want to highlight one notable difference between the pandemic mandates and what needs to happen around climate mandates. The things that we were called upon to do in the pandemic, for the most part, were anathema to all of our social instincts. You know, mask up, be distant, isolate. That's hard. I mean, no wonder we're all sick of it after 2 years. The good news with respect to the climate emergency is that the things we will be called upon to do are precisely the opposite, to go out and do something grand together. And I'm convinced that we can do that for a few years.
Thank you. So anyone who wants to unmute themselves, just go ahead. Speak up, ask your questions, be interactive.
Just wanted to say thank you.
Thanks, Samantha.
Anybody else?
Well, if people are quiet and we're coming to the end of our time, let me just share. I've just put in the link, the specific link to sign up for the newsletter for the Climate Emergency Unit. And I hope you'll do that so that you can stay informed about our different campaigns. I want to reiterate the importance of the voices of physicians like you in this moment, both as individuals and through your institutions. If we're going to win, and the path to victory is indeed narrow, it's going to be because non-environmental institutional voices are signaling clearly and forcefully to political leaders, we're in emergency. And I think, this was the strength of the campaign launched by CAPE last week around the fossil fuel ad ban. Your voice has a particular role in terms of protecting people's health in the face of an emergency. It's one that's respected, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. And when you use it to signal that an emergency health crisis is again at our doorstep, it's an important one. And it helps to shift the zeitgeist.
Thank you. Seth, I really want to thank you for joining us this evening. I highly recommend the book. It's, common sense prevails in that book. And what I like is that you basically present a solution for, all the problems, but the what ifs and the buts that people throw in your way. And you'll go, yeah, but we can do it this way, or here's an answer to that. And, it's so easy for people to say, but we can't because of this and that. And you literally go through all the plans A, plan B, plan C, like this is what we can do. This is what we have to do to get people on board, the equity, the indigenous, everything. So it's really tremendous. And I want to thank you so much for bringing that into your talk and for also bringing up the COVID, because you wrote the book prior to COVID. And then you saw that indeed Canada can do it, but not necessarily yet for climate. So I just want to say it was a most interesting and inspiring talk, and thank you for all your detailed responses to everyone's questions.
Thank you.
Really
Thanks very much. All right. Nice to join you all. Thanks, everybody.
There.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye-bye.